Hello, my name is Madison Laurie, and today I will be presenting on my policy recommendation regarding solitary confinement. This policy recommendation is not one that comes from an opinion, but rather one of facts based off of the research of numerous experts in the field on the negative psychological, physical, monetary, long-term, and recidivistic effects of solitary confinement. To begin, solitary confinement is defined as the keeping of an inmate with little meaningful contact to others. Today, in the United States, we house about 80,000 inmates this way. The conditions of solitary confinement consist of an inmate being kept in one cell for 23 out of the 24 hours a day, with 1 hour of exercise outside of the cell away from all other inmates. The cell itself is about 80 square feet, consists of only artificial light, a bed, a sink, and a toilet. Now that we understand exactly what solitary confinement is, it's important to outline how long our offenders are kept in solitary confinement for. To begin, an inmate will be sentenced either with long-term or short-term solitary confinement. Short-term solitary confinement is an inmate being kept in solitary confinement for anything under 3 weeks, while long-term solitary confinement is anything over 3 weeks, whether that be months or possibly years. As you can see in the graph, the largest percent of solitary confinement inmates, 29%, are housed for anywhere from 1 to 3 months consecutively in solitary confinement, with Florida, New York, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons all housing their largest percentage of solitary confinement inmates in this way for this period of time. As you can see, there are also some extremes, such as the 3.75% that are housed in solitary confinement consecutively for at least 6 years or more, with Texas holding a large percentage of their solitary confinement inmates for this amount of time. Now that we know exactly how long our offenders are kept in solitary confinement, it's important to acknowledge how long it takes for the negative effects that I'll be discussing in the next slides of this presentation to take hold on the inmates. Psychologist Craig Haney conducted many studies and interviews of prisoners in solitary confinement. From these studies and interviews, it allowed him to conclude that there is a 10-day time period in which inmates can be housed in solitary confinement without large psychological effects. Once an inmate is housed for over these 10 days, the psychological effects are more likely to take a much stronger hold in the inmates of solitary confinement. Along with this, psychologist Toke also acknowledged that it is important for the inmate to be aware of how long they are spending in solitary confinement. Psychologist Toke found that inmates who are unaware of the amount of time that they're spending in solitary confinement can lead to an increase in hostility and panic in the inmates. Now we can address the negative effects that solitary confinement has on its inmates, beginning with, perhaps most importantly, the negative psychological effects. Among these are depression, hallucinations, self-harm, development or worsening of mental illnesses, and suicide. Suicide is misproportionately represented in the solitary confinement inmates. An example of this is in New York, where 43% of their total suicide inmates are made up by those in solitary confinement. This leaves those in solitary confinement at a 12 times higher risk of committing suicide than those in the general population. Another important psychological effect is that of SHU syndrome. Psychologist Gratian interviewed numerous solitary confinement inmates and found that all of them, after the 10-day period, had developed SHU syndrome, which consists of affective disturbance, thinking and memory problems, lack of impulse control, and anxiety. All of these inmates were showing these symptoms of SHU syndrome, and since all of these symptoms were present and had a strong hold in the inmates, this led Dr. Gratian to decide, quote, use of solitary confinement carries major psychiatric risk. It's important to acknowledge that solitary confinement does not only have a negative psychological effect, but a negative physical effect as well. Some of these being skin problems, musculoskeletal pain, and weight loss. It's important to note here that many of these physical effects have a very strong tie to the psychological effects that we just discussed. An example of this would be that if an inmate is in solitary confinement and is already developing any of the symptoms of SHU syndrome or any of the symptoms of solitary confinement on the psyche in general, they could be experiencing severe panic and anxiety. These effects will take hold on the prisoner, coinciding with their physical effects, such as a skin rash, leading the prisoners to become extremely obsessed and normally worsening their physical effects because of the psychological effects coinciding with them. Solitary confinement also has effects that do not leave as soon as the prisoner is released. Some examples of these are lack of self-control and self-initiative, adaptations to solitary confinement becoming an integral part of the inmate, and paranoia and social anxiety. It's also important to acknowledge that these two have a strong psychiatric connection because many of the psychiatric effects that the inmates developed from solitary confinement turned into long-term effects when they followed them after their release, whether that be for months, years, or possibly for the rest of their life. Solitary confinement also has a direct effect on inmate recidivism. Dr. Luigi, a psychologist who conducted numerous studies of solitary confinement inmates, concluded that solitary confinement carries an increased risk for any form of recidivism in inmates. This includes risk of reincarceration and risk of violent offenses. Dr. Luigi also made a connection that the longer that the inmates were in the solitary confinement for, the more increased that their risk of recidivism became. It's also important to acknowledge that solitary confinement does not only carry risks for the inmates and the guards who are directly dealing with it, but for everyday taxpayers like you and I. Solitary confinement is an extremely expensive way to house prisoners, as it costs $78,000 to house a prisoner this way for just 1 year. This is over 3 times the amount that it costs to house prisoners in general population prisons, and it boils down to about $214 per day. When you take the $214 per day by the average time and average people who are in solitary confinement, you'll see that we're spending anywhere from $5.13 million to $1.54 billion on solitary confinement. It's also important to know that while we have acknowledged the risks of solitary confinement, many others have as well, making it more likely that the policy that I will be recommending will be able to be implemented. Some examples of this are New York, where they outlawed solitary confinement in juveniles, Arizona, where they're providing greater mental health treatment for those in solitary confinement, New Mexico, where they outlawed the use of solitary confinement on juveniles and the mentally ill, and also outlawed consecutive stays for over 15 days, or states such as Colorado and California, who are simply lessening their use of solitary confinement in general. It's also important to state that not only have states recommended that our use of solitary confinement right now is flawed, but prisons as well. An example of this would be Pelican Bay State Prison, who lessened their total use of solitary confinement from 1,056 to only 300. It's also important for me to acknowledge that the point of the policy that I will be stating in the next slide is not to completely rid the use of solitary confinement. I acknowledge and understand that there are reasonable and necessary uses for solitary confinement in our prison systems. The most pertinent of these reasons, perhaps, would be to promote the health and safety of staff and inmates. The use of solitary confinement allows staff to get inmates away when they are going on violent sprees directed towards other guards or inmates. Along with this, solitary confinement was not originally made to be a strict, punitive, harsh form of punishment, but was actually intended to be a rehabilitative measure so that inmates could have time to get away from all the craziness that they were experiencing and be able to think about the wrong that they had done and how they can do better in the future. If we implement the policy that I will be addressing in the next slide, we will be able to see solitary confinement go back to its original rehabilitative and effective use. Before I state exactly what my policy recommendation is, I want to note that my policy recommendation focused mainly on reducing the psychological effects of solitary confinement on inmates. I chose to do this because from my research it showed that the psychological effects tend to have a great weight on both the physical effects, the long-term effects, and the recidivistic effects as well. I move that in my policy to make it a maximum stay in solitary confinement to be no longer than 7 consecutive days for the most violent offenses, and for the lesser offenses to be about 3 days consecutively. By doing this, we'll allow solitary confinement to stay under the 10-day time period that Dr. Craig Haney had acknowledged. Whenever we stay under this time period, we will lessen the negative psychological effects. When we lessen the psychological effects, we'll lessen how pertinent the physical effects feel, we'll lessen the long-term psychological effects inflicted on the prisoners, and we will lessen the recidivistic effect because the prisoners will not have the psychological effects so ingrained in them. This policy is also twofold, also proposing that we make it mandatory for an inmate to be aware of the time that they are going to be spending in solitary confinement. As we saw, whenever inmates are aware, they are less hostile and less panicky towards others, which will also allow less psychological effects to take hold on the inmate. If we are able to implement this policy and keep it so that inmates are not spending any more than 7 consecutive days in solitary confinement and are aware to the amount of time that they will be spending in solitary confinement, we will indeed see that the psychological risks inflicted by solitary confinement will lessen, which will then lessen the physical, monetary, long-term, and recidivistic effects as well. By doing this, we will be able to return solitary confinement to the use for rehabilitative, protective, and effective measure that it was originally intended to be. Thank you.